about this incredible site in a
We need
neighboring
more.
country. But one point to make, Randall was talking about the second event, 11,600 years ago. We're dealing with an episode of cataclysm, which begins 12,800 years ago and ends 11,600 years ago. Both episodes accompanied by massive floods. And the 11,600 years ago date, I may have mentioned this last year, it's in Magicians of the Gods. What's interesting about that is the exact date that Plato gives us for the destruction of the lost civilization of Atlantis. Plato, that's the only source we have for Atlantis. It comes to us, many people think it's all over the place, but it's not. Atlantis comes to us from the Greek philosopher Plato, who lived around 340 BC. And he got the story through his family line, from his ancestor Solon, who had visited Egypt in 600 BC. And there Solon was told of a great civilization that had existed on Earth that was the progenitor civilization of Egypt, but that was destroyed in a terrible cataclysm. And he asked, a cataclysm involving a gigantic flood, and Atlantis was submerged beneath the waves and was never seen again. And so Solon said to the priests, when did this happen? And they said 9,000 years ago. That was in 600 BC. So that's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That's Meltwater Pulse 1b. How could they know? You know?
How could they know?
We have to start taking this stuff more seriously. Instead of sneering at it and skepticizing it out of existence, we need to leave a little bit of room for extraordinary ideas possibly being right. That's the main beef I have with the skeptics, is that they want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
I want to add something to that. In the Timaeus, Plato discusses Atlantis in 2 dialogues. And in the Timaeus, he prefaces the story of Atlantis by recounting the myth of Phaeton. Now, the myth of Phaeton is a very interesting story. And Plato then, after referencing that myth, he then says, now, this has the form of a myth, but what it really represents is a declination or a declining of the bodies in space orbiting around the Earth and an eventual falling to Earth of one of those bodies and a conflagration of all things triggered by the fall of that body.
It's intriguing that he mentions the zodiac because the Taurid Meteor stream is so called because it appears to come at us from the direction of the constellation of Taurus, a zodiacal constellation. That's where those shooting stars, amongst which are some very large objects that have hit us in the past and can hit us again in the future, that's where they come from. They come from that area of the sky.
It's actually an illusion. It appears that they're not actually coming from Taurus.
It looks like that. They come from that area of the sky. Yeah.
They come from that area of the sky. And so anybody in ancient times who was witnessing, and according to the Victor Klube and William Napier and those guys who are the British neo-catastrophists that have been doing all of this work for decades on the Taurid meteor shower, have concluded that, in times past, it was an extremely active shower and would have created some pretty darn impressive light shows, even if it wasn't causing catastrophes down here below. But what they're coming from the direction of the sun, right? But that's exactly where, on June 30th, a Taurid meteor would be coming from. And then also the fact that it's the perfect date for the peak of the shower and the correct place in the sky, to me, is pretty convincing evidence that it was most likely a remnant of that Taurid stream. The other time that the Earth crosses is late October, early November. In fact, we've just passed out of it within the last week, basically. But it peaks, interestingly, coincidentally, between like October 30th and November 4th or 5th. So it's peaking right around Halloween time. In fact, they've been called the Halloween meteors, and there's some very interesting...
Halloween fireworks, sometimes they call them.
The Halloween fireworks, yeah. But there's some very interesting work done by a researcher back around the early 20th century named Grant Halliburton, who spent about 15 years researching the connections between ancient calendars. And he concluded one thing very interesting was that a lot of these ancient calendars were being synchronized by people's observations of the rise and fall of the Pleiades, which is the shoulder of the And so what he then found out, though, was that in many cases, that our modern Halloween actually goes back thousands of years to an ancient Day of the Dead that was observed all over the earth at the same time every year, even in the southern hemisphere, and it usually revolved around a commemoration of the culmination of the Pleiades, which is when the Pleiades crosses the local meridian. In other words, it reaches the keystone of the royal arch, so to speak, up in the sky. So if you go out on Halloween now and you face the south in the northern hemisphere, you will see the Pleiades right at midnight. At midnight, they will be, if you think of the arch of the zodiac as being like a clock, it's right there at midnight, right? Well, here's the interesting link, is that in all of these myths, what Halliburton discovered over and over again was that the Day of the Dead ultimately went back to myths of the destruction of the world by a great flood and or fire.
It's fascinating that it's all coming out of the constellation Taurus, too, and it's the celestial bull that they're fighting in these ancient myths, and that all these cultures around the world are celebrating the Day of the Dead at this exact same time. This is amazing stuff.
And right now our science is closing its eyes to this. I think it's fair to say, with the Taurid Meteor stream, which is a very big issue in this whole discussion, that we are dealing with a hidden hand in human history. It's something that is going to ultimately require us to re-explain almost everything. The skeptics hate it. They can't bear it because, first of all, it involves cataclysms. And secondly, it involves the possibility of losing a whole civilization from the record. It's really interesting when you look at the dates of this cluster, this episode of bombardment between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. That's the period that just immediately precedes what mainstream academia think of as the very beginnings of civilization. And they've just never, maybe it's not even their fault. This is so recent, this science is so new that they've not had time to adapt to it. But if they adapt to it and take this into account, then suddenly what was an extraordinary and absurd and impossible idea, that there was a lost civilization 12,000 years ago, becomes a very plausible and reasonable idea. And then we start, once we take that on board, then we can start opening our eyes to archaeological anomalies, like the Great Sphinx, like Baalbek, like submerged ruins, like Göbekli Tepe, and begin to consider, what does all this mean? Are we, in fact, a species with amnesia? Are we here forgetful of the truth about ourselves? Maybe that's why we're so fucked up, because we just actually don't know. We've made up a story about where we came from and what we are.